Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at this webinar, Leveraging Inclusive Procurement Amid COVID-19. I hope you're all well, and we are very excited about today's webinar. We have some great speakers with us, and we hope that you will both learn from our speakers, but also share your thoughts around this topic. My name is Anna Fälth. I'm the manager of the We Empower G7 program. It's a program funded by the European Union. And we are running these webinars on different topics related to the women's empowerment principles to also help us understand better how to implement the women's empowerment principles. And specifically, we are focusing on the G7 and the EU through these webinars. And I'm happy to welcome our speakers today. We have Anna Lupi from DG Grow. We have Stephanie Luong from Amfori, one web signatory from this year that just signed in February this year. So we are very excited to have a new web signatory on board. And then we'll also hear from Anna Golob, who is our policy analyst in the economic empowerment section, who will also share some information about what we do in UN Women on this topic. So today we will have two presentations. We will probably start with Stephanie Luong until we wait for Anna Lupi from DG Grow to be connected, and then we would look forward really to hear from you, your experiences and your questions to the speakers, and then we will hear from Anna. So I mentioned the women's empowerment principles. There are 7 of them for those that are new to these principles, but today we will focus specifically on principle 5. It focuses on 2 very, very important issues. One is to implement enterprise development supply chains, but also on marketing practices that empower women. You have this as a snapshot from our website. So I hope that if you're curious to learn more about this, you can go to weps.org and you'll find more information about the particular recommendations that we have for implementation of Principle 5. We will also hear from our speakers today on how they've gone about it, both from the public side and the private side, sector side, on how we can address this very important topic. And we are all in different situations and different phases of the COVID-19 reopenings. And what we have seen is that the COVID-19 has, on the one hand, really put a magnifier on gender inequalities and inequalities more broadly. And we found that this is a very good time to revisit your strategies and policies on how you go about in being inclusive and diverse in your supply chain. We have, at the same time, we also see that there's an uptake from the ESG, on the ESG agenda, that the social is becoming increasingly important. And we know that the way that companies are responding to the COVID-19 will be determinant also going forward, or how sustainable their enterprises will be, but also how, to what effect they will be able to attract talent, attract business partners, and to what extent the suppliers will be there in their supply chain as we are opening up from the COVID-19 crisis. We can go to the next. So just a little heads up for those that would like to participate in the discussion. You can use freely the chat box to provide your comments and questions. But if you'd like to get the microphone and actually speak to us, raise your hand and we will give you an opportunity when we come to the Q&A session. So we will start, I think we'll start with Stephanie Luong. Welcome very much from the Vice President for Public Affairs at Amfori. I will hand it over to you to start your presentation, and then we will go to Anna Lupi when she joins us on the webinar. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar today. So, as Anna explained, I'm Stephanie Leung. I represent Amphori, and I would like to start by telling you a little bit more about our organization. If we could move to the PowerPoint slide. Yeah, yes. So, for those who are not familiar, Amphori is a business association of 2,400 retailers, brands, and importers come together with the same vision that trade actually has to bring more than profit, but it has to benefit the people and the environment. And we call this trade with purpose. You can move to the next slide. So those 2,400 companies all together, you can see that they have a big purchasing power and they all are very influential because combined, they represent a turnover of over than 1.5 trillion euros. And when they join our organization, they also engage their supply chain, and we currently have actually 55,000 factories and farms which are being engaged in this trade for purpose objective. You can move to the next slide. So you can see here that actually our members, they come from all corners of the world. Also, we are rooted in Europe, and I'm actually joining from Brussels today. So we have multinational, we have SMEs, we have also trade, national trade association, and they sell, our members sell all kinds of consumer goods. Can be textile, can be food, toys, cosmetics, etc. What do we do concretely? Concretely, we offer our members practical supply chain tools so that they can monitor and they can improve the social and environmental performance of their supply chain. And in addition, we offer them something really special as an association. Is really the power of collaboration. It's the idea that if you want to tackle social and environmental issue, you're better to work together through our network that we have really in Asia, in the Americas, in Europe and Africa, as well as also by engaging together towards governments, towards stakeholders to tackle complex issues and make the sustainable development goals a reality. Can move to the next slide. So, and what about women? Actually, when we look at the supply chain of our members, women represent the majority of the workforce in the supply chain. I think we're counting globally in the supply chain around 190 million women, and they are the most vulnerable. So we see that for many women which are involved in the supply chain of our members, having a job, it really represents the possibility to have a better future. But at the same time, there are those which are going to face, the excessive hours, the unsafe working conditions, the low wages. So we've decided to tackle this and to set up a gender equality and women empowerment strategy that we launched actually in March 2020, really the full strategy with the objective to contribute to the goal number 5 of the SDGs. And that strategy is based on 2 pillars. On one hand, it's about having the right tools to identify the issues that women are facing in the supply chain and the workplace, and at the same time doing advocacy, raising awareness, promoting gender equality with all our stakeholders. You can move to the next slide. So this is just to explain you a little bit how we build up this strategy. When we started with women empowerment, working on women empowerment in 2018. As we launched the program in 3 countries, China, India, Bangladesh, because they are the countries where actually most of the consumer goods that our members sell are being produced in those countries. And what we wanted to do is to raise awareness amongst producers that women empowerment is good for their business and it's good for their society. And we developed empowering programs that tackle female workforce, but also very importantly the male colleagues, so that they could also change their perception, and because they are often in the managerial roles in the factories, that they would put in place the right environment for women to be able to move towards supervisory and higher paid roles. So those activities due to COVID-19, I think it's important. I want to highlight that they have been paused because the factories are closed. So the women were also the first one to, some factories are closed to really see that to be impacted. We are going to very soon restart them. And then in May 2019, we signed the UNEC Declaration of Gender Responsive Standards with the idea to really commit to continuously make our standard integrating gender equality. And last but not least, in February this year, we signed the UN Women Empowerment Principles. So what it means is that the scope of our strategy is expanding because we are moving from a focus on the factory floor and the farms to also the headquarters of the companies, with the idea that consistency and commitment from the highest level is key. So we can move to the next slide. So yes, what we see, I described a little bit the situation because what we see is that in normal times, women in the supply chain are already amongst the most vulnerable. I mentioned the low skills job, the lower wages, job insecurity, violence, stress at work. But then it means also when there's a global crisis like COVID-19, the women are going to be even hit even more because of the situation they were ready to start with. And for us at Amfori, what we discussed also very quickly is that we really need to look into responsible purchasing practices, because having good responsible purchasing practices will improve anyway female as well as male worker situation. So everybody will be positively impacted. And we have been looking into that. So we are going to move to the next slide. So we published recently our responsible purchasing practices guidelines that have been shared with all our members. They're going to bring them also to their producers. And in these guidelines, we have really paid particular attention to women in the purchasing decision. What we also say is most steps which can be taken by companies to improve their purchasing practices will be beneficial, as I was saying, to all workers, but there are also very specific steps which can improve the situation of women. So on the next slide, you will see the type of general advice, yes, that actually works for all companies and for all workers, male or female. It's things like do not cancel orders which are already in production. Do not put pressure on essential product producer or importers. Do not renegotiate prices or payment terms. This works for everybody. And we also highlighted certain, let's say, good practices, which are about, of course, shipment of all the prepared orders, proceed with the payment as much as possible as usual, understand local context. And I think one of the things we really highlight here to our members is that gender issue has not been seen limited to the discrimination aspect. It actually cuts across all the social performance aspect of a factory, being health and safety, working time compensation, freedom of association, and collective bargaining as well. So when a company integrates gender equality as a central focus of its supply chain program, it will reduce discrimination and it will improve all the other factors as well. For that, what we recommend our members is dialogue. And in the context of the crisis, everything was going so fast, so there was a temptation just to have email relationship, you know, in the supply chain. I cancel my orders and finished. No, what we said is you need to create a dialogue. You need to create a space where you can understand challenges that the producers are also facing and understand if there are specific needs linked to female workers in the special local context. So here on that, on the email, you can see exactly the specific advice we also give for women in the supply chain. So apart from that work, what do our members also doing? You have here example of we encourage and we will continue to encourage our members to sign the UN Women Empowerment Principle. We have already a few which have embarked on this journey. We encourage them, of course, to complement it with very practical projects in supply chains, such as our Shugula project in Bangladesh, which I mentioned earlier on. You can move to the next slide, where you will see concrete example of what some of our members have been doing. Everybody, as I said, received the guidance on responsible purchasing practices, and some of them already, we just put here example who came up with very concrete actions. Aldi South, for instance, when it is about committing to pay suppliers for all the finished goods and the goods which were in production, or El Corte Inglés, which is a member who decided to more focus on the domestic violence, because we all know that it has increased during the COVID-19 period, and they invested on this aspect. We can move to the next slide. So what are we going to do to continue with? A part of our work, so we have the tools for the supply chain, and as I mentioned before, promoting, talking about the women empowerment in the supply chain is key. This is part of our advocacy role that we do globally and locally. We will continue to do that, and not alone. We embark with other stakeholders on that. We have a joint statement. We also will deepen our relation with UN Women, and we are going to really promote the signature of the Women Empowerment Principle to all our members, with the idea that we need really collaborative actions to move this issue forward. It's a complex issue, but we are convinced that with everybody embarking on it, we will make great results. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this excellent presentation, and we are very excited to hear that you're not only taking the WEPs framework into your own organization, but spreading it across your membership. So thank you so much. I wonder if we have Anna Lupi from DG Grow on the line. I know she had some difficulties connecting. Do we have Anna?
Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent. Thank you. So over to you.
I'm really sorry. You won't be able to see me, and I have a slightly rickety system to connect, but I can definitely see you. So at least there's some visuals involved. So hello everyone. I'm Anna Lupi. I work for the European Commission in the department dealing with the internal market of the EU, industry, entrepreneurship, and small and medium enterprises. And I deal more specifically with public procurement policy in the EU. And I'm responsible in particular for, let's say, pushing EU member states to integrate in their procurement social considerations. If we can go to the next slide, please. So today I wanted to talk mainly about, first of all, how the policy that we have on sustainable procurement tackles the issue of gender mainstreaming and gender equality, give you a flavor a bit of how these themes can fit in the EU legal framework for public procurement, and also what public authorities in the EU are doing in this field, and what we are trying to do at the moment to support them to continue and to improve their efforts in this sense. Next slide, please. So basically, as you will see with the next slide, we have a set of what we call directives. They're basically like law instruments setting obligations for the EU member states. And the last batch of these, the last reform was adopted in 2014, and since then we've developed our procurement policy in a direction where we want to encourage national authorities to move away from buying based on the logic of the lowest price and encourage them to use quality criteria. And in this context, we want to prioritize, of course, the use of sustainability criteria. So we have actually two complementary, let's say, branches of sustainable public procurement policy, which deal with environmental aspects, and this is what we call green public procurement criteria. But also we have socially responsible public procurement, which deals more specifically with, let's say, on the one hand, making sure that social and labor and human rights obligations are complied in the performance of public procurement contracts, but also that contracting authorities, public buyers, can pursue social objectives through their procurement initiatives. And so there are various objectives that they can pursue through public procurement, among which, of course, the social and professional integration of disadvantaged people. We have a very wide definition of disadvantaged people. Actually, we leave a lot of freedom to member states to decide who can be defined as disadvantaged, and often what is included in this category is victims of violence and discrimination. Of course, there is also a push to ensure human rights and labor rights compliance throughout the supply chains, not only within the EU, but also globally and internationally. And there are efforts also to promote equality and equal opportunities through public procurement. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So we have three different instruments in the EU regulating public procurement, but essentially the rules are very similar when it comes to how to integrate social considerations or how to guarantee compliance with public procurement. But I thought it would be nice for you to visualize this, because sometimes it's very difficult to understand. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as I was saying, the main two ways in which you can frame the issue of gender equality and gender mainstreaming in public procurement within the EU is, first of all, to think about how to make sure that that certain labor and social obligations are complied within the context of a public procurement procedure. So when the contract is executed, when the service is provided, and when the goods are delivered to the public authority. And in this context, the EU legislation requires national authorities to make sure that the operators, the contractors that they choose to deliver the contract, are in compliance with national rules, with EU rules, and also with some international rules, and in particular the ILO core conventions. What does it mean to comply with these rules? For example, in this specific context, it means complying with any existing national obligation on work-life balance, on requiring certain safety measures on the workplace, requiring banning discrimination, requiring equal pay, etc., etc. And of course, if a contractor is in compliance, there may be procedural issues. So there may be, let's say, this may trigger consequences that determine the fact that a bidder will not be able to win the contract or will be kicked out of the procedure. but it can also produce contractual consequences. So if, as a contractor, even if you win the contract, if there's a clause, a contract clause that says that basically the contractual relationship is subject, the continuation of the contractual relationship is subject to you as a contractor complying with these obligations, then of course, if you violate them, there will be sanctions, there will be escalation measures up to the contract being terminated by the public authority. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the other way in which the theme of gender mainstreaming can be taken into account is through specific tender requirements. So these are not obligations that are imposed by the law, but they are specific choices that the public buyer, the public authority can make in the context of procuring a service or a product or work. Whatever consideration they put into the tender specifications, of course, must be linked to what is being purchased. This is very important because it has a consequence in terms of, it has an effect on what the public buyer can require from the contractor. But these considerations can be included at any stage of the procurement. They can relate to the whole life cycle. And in most cases, when we talk about gender-based considerations, they affect, let's say, the performance of the contract and the staff that is employed to perform the public contract. So these would relate, for example, to the characteristics of a certain product or a certain service. So you may require, for example, that if you know that the beneficiaries of the service that you're purchasing as a public authority are going to include certain vulnerable people, for example, victims of violence, then you might want the characteristics of the service to be adapted. You want your contractor to commit to adopting certain measures to make sure that the service really caters appropriately for these type of beneficiaries. It might mean also that the production process or the delivery of the contract has certain characteristics. For example, when you assess the bids and you award the contract, you may give preference to bids that include a gender equality plan for the performance of the contract. But it also can mean that you can impose a certain number of conditions when it comes to hiring or the treatment also of the staff which is performing the contract. So you can require higher standards of work-life balance going beyond what the law requires. You can require training. You can require efforts from your contractor and subcontractors to employ a certain underemployed gender in a certain function. For example, if you know usually there's not a lot of women engineers working in a certain field, you can require your contractor to make an extra effort to employ more women engineers in the performance of the contract and so on. As I was saying, can we go to the next slide? But just very quickly to give you an idea, this mandatory link of each of these considerations to the subject matter of the contract, of course, prevents you from requiring a company-wide policy. So, for example, you cannot require a gender plan to apply to the whole company, but you can require that the contractor provides a gender plan for the staff that is performing the contract. And also you cannot require You cannot give preference, let's say, to operators which are women-led. But of course, you can require, for example, specific experience from your contractor in case you know it's going to have to deal with certain gender issues. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So just to give you an idea of a public authority in Europe who has tried to apply gender-based considerations in procurement across the board, the city of Vienna has been working on different pilot projects since 2010 with the objective of addressing a persisting gender pay gap, which they identified at local level, but also to promote gender equality in the labor markets and ensuring that when it comes to the beneficiary of local services, women and men have equal access. And they've used a lot of different instruments, but the first thing that they did was to set up a working group on gender equality at municipal level, focusing specifically on public procurement practices. And they run different pilot projects to see what could work in terms of like having an actual impact for pursuing these objectives. They issued some guidelines for enterprises. So that's a very good practice that we rarely see, I have to say, in public procurement, because very often public authorities are focused on their own action in public procurement, and they forget to talk to the market, and they forget to sort of prepare the market to let's say work together with them to achieve certain objectives. And then they also trained, of course, their own public buyers, and they came up with different concrete solutions like contract clauses where the tenderers had to commit to promote female employment in certain areas of the contract. They took particular care to prepare well the tender, so they looked in their needs assessment before they prepared tender specifications, how they could promote women employment, if there was any gender angle to the procurement in particular. And they also used award criteria, which is, it's the EU jargon for saying that basically they set criteria of preference for organizations or staff with a specific special training in gender equality issues, for example. And then, can we go to the last slide? This particular good practice is part of a collection of good practices that we've put together with a project that we are currently running on socially responsible public procurement. So it's part of this, let's say, wider pool of practices on integrating social objectives in public procurement. And there's a dissemination campaign connected to it, because we want also to continue raising awareness on the topic of socially responsible public procurement in general. And you will see that in this slide, it's titled #WeBuySocialEU. And you will find, on the same slide, you will find a link to the collection of good practices. At the same time, last year, we've run a series of workshops in different EU member states to raise awareness on the use of social considerations in public procurement. It was targeting specifically local public authorities, precisely because they are often the public buyers that are more interested in this kind of topics, but at the same time, less equipped to deal with them. They have fewer resources, and they have fewer employees and fewer experts, and the social economy as well. And then we're also working on an updated guidance on socially responsible public procurement, which should come out this year still. And it will also include examples and indications for public buyers on how to integrate socially responsible clauses in their procurement. And this includes also gender-based aspects. I hope this was not too confusing because public procurement can be quite confusing sometimes. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anna. This was great. Thank you so much. I actually have, we have a few questions from our audience, from our participants, and I have one question myself to both of you. Do you see, because you have really great policies and practices in place, but do you see that there is a shift in the uptake of these policies and practices in view of the COVID-19? Do you see the shifting behavior, that people are getting more interested in this, or do you see the same, or you see that we're sliding backwards? I will take a few questions so that we can also have a chance to hear from our third Anna Gallo a little bit later, but we have a few questions. So the first one is specifically to Stephanie. How do you make sure that women in the supply chains of your members actually know that you have this great policies, and how do they know of your efforts? So are you working more specifically with your members, or do you also have some advocacy that go beyond to make women aware that this is happening? So that was one question. And then from Mohammed, and then we have from Kwazi. She's from Bangladesh, and she works very closely with poor women and girls. And her question is more around how the work that you do can help influence the work around domestic violence of women and girls in local communities, and what other kind of investment could we do there. And then we have a question from Gabriella. Has the EU enacted something in regards to preferential treatment to certified women-owned businesses? So you are probably familiar with the certification efforts that are going on. We Connect, and among other organizations, are there specific preferential treatment for women-owned businesses? And the final question that we have, actually there's more coming in, is also from Natasha, specifically for Stephanie. If the survey that you have for your members and producers, is that publicly available? And if it isn't, could you share a little bit about what it contains, or are you able to share that, those questions with the participants? And hang on, many questions. I hope you have a chance to take note of this. How do you verify, this is coming from Aida, how do you verify or ensure compliance with social standards, including in the contract during contract implementation? That's a lot of questions, but maybe we can start with Stephanie, and then I will ask Anna Lupi to also answer, and then we have more questions coming in. So we'll start with those, and we'll take some more questions. Stephanie, do you want to start?
Yes, so there were a lot of questions. I will take them in the order. So there was a question about how do we only do advocacy to stakeholders and governments, or do we actually also talk directly to women in the factory and in the farms? And yes, we do, and this is what we started in 2018, really putting in place what we call the Shobola project in Bangladesh. Will also be extended to India, where we actually work with women workers as well as their supervisors to raise their awareness on violence in the workplace, sexual harassment, all the discrimination that women can face. We also give them additional skills, notably managerial skills, with the objective that they can improve their career and move to supervisory role. We do so. That's what we pilot in 3 countries, in different countries at this stage, with the objective to draw some lessons from this and to see how we can expand it to other countries. So how do we? So this is for specific project. But one thing I want to say is there is also material that we use, notably poster that we put in the different factories where there is information linked to our policy, so our code of conduct, as well as specifically related to women empowerment. So that was one of the questions. There was as well a question with regard to our survey. Yes, on one of the slides, indeed, it explained that when COVID-19 hit really our members and their producers, we asked them, okay, what do we need? What do you expect from us? How can we help you? And this, the result of the survey are not public, but I can elaborate a little bit to say that the first reaction, being members, being producers in Bangladesh, in China, and in India, everywhere, was to say that they needed governmental support measures. Basically, that was really the first thing to help, because they could see that economically it was going to be really hard, so to help with the recovery. The second thing was to say we really need to have a dialogue with buyers. We need to adopt sustainable sourcing practices and to discuss the challenges, because we understand the buyers are facing challenges, but at the other side of the supply chain as well. And this is how we came with this responsible purchasing practices guidance. So this is it. There was a question about domestic violence. What we address is violence in the workplace, specifically in our training. But indirectly, we talk about the violence in general. So this is also addressed as, I mean, being in the workplace or being at home, violence is not acceptable, you know. Did I cover all the questions? How do you verify that social standards? So actually, I'm sorry, we are improvement based and we are not certification scheme. It means that we provide, we have a code of conduct that the members and the producers are going to implement in the supply chain. They are going to go through training to improve their skills and be in a better position to bit by bit be able to be in compliance with all those social standards. And it's more than social compliance, it's actually social performance, because it often goes above the national law. And what we do is there are regular audits, which are like an exam or a test to evaluate if there has been improvement. It's like a test. It means that the objective is to evaluate the situation and see what other improvement training specific program can be taken to continue the improvement phase. And I think there was one question, I think from you, Anna. You were asking me, do you see that do you think that something has changed with COVID-19? And I do think that yes, it has. My perception in the sense that we see through our companies that they want this crisis to be an opportunity, to use it somehow as an opportunity to adjust and change things. I'm thinking also at the EU level, we have currently discussion about mandatory human rights due diligence. That topic is still on the agenda. We see that we can really have constructive discussion about the balance between economic recovery and at the same time continuing having ambition on human rights, women empowerment topics. And for us, as I said, we just launched our strategy on gender equality, and it means also that in everything we do, we commit to take a gender lens. COVID-19 is just making this even more important.
Thank you for confirming that. So I'll hand it over to Anna to respond to the questions. Anna Lupi.
Yeah, Yeah, I will probably start with the first one on the effects of COVID-19. Certainly, I completely agree with Stephanie that there's politically a much stronger will to shorten supply chains, to pay more attention to due diligence and to social rights, to employment as well. So that's indeed very positive, and I see this particularly in Brussels. In the EU milieu, I have to say that it's there's quite a big push to be more socially responsible. At the same time, what we've seen in the past few months in the member states is that public buyers, public authorities are under quite a lot of time and budgetary pressure, and they are bracing because the crisis will probably mean that they might not have enough resources to spend on certain services. So there's a bit, it's been a little bit difficult in the past 2 or 3 months to keep preaching that, you know, if you buy something, you have to be socially responsible. If you buy something, you have to make sure that you keep the employment standards high, and that you actually cater for the needs of the people to whom you're providing the service. So there's a bit this dichotomy. It's difficult to predict what will happen in the future, but it's certainly positive that at least at high level there's this increasing commitment towards pursuing social objectives. There's an interesting question on how do you verify social standards. It's an issue that for us still remains fairly open. First of all, it depends very much on how you set your requirements in public procurement, in particular during the tender procedure, but also in terms of contract clauses. I mean, what kind of indicators, but also the indicators have to be, of course, consistent with the kinds of objectives that you want to reach. And the question is also if you, as a public buyer, want to keep track, to have some sort of like data collection or sort of like lessons learned reflection at the end of the contract. There are still many public buyers who do not routinely do that. And that is, of course, an issue because they don't know what the impact of what they've done has been, and they don't know whether they can correct themselves afterwards. And of course, the other issue here is when it comes to verifying social standards is measurements, which are never easy when it comes to social considerations, of course. There are some things that are fairly easy to measure with numbers, like what number of women employee you've managed to have in your contract by the end of it, what, you know, how many hours they worked, etc. But some other standards might not be very easy to measure, like for example, whether, you know, you've actually helped through your social services victims of violence. That's a very open question, and it really boils down to what are your objectives, how you design the service, how do you want, like, what's the take that you have on the social service you're delivering. And finally, there was a question also on certifications for women-led businesses. I am aware that there are initiatives ongoing in that field. I'm not sure, as I was explaining, whether it's possible and to what extent it is possible to use those in public procurement in the EU, because of this requirement that all tender criteria have to be related strictly to the product that is being bought, or its characteristics, or the staff that is performing the contract. It may be difficult to use labels that focus specifically on promoting women-led businesses. So it will depend very much on how they are devised. I don't exclude that it's possible to use them, because it's now, I mean, the EU law says explicitly that you can use labels in public procurement, but it will really depend on what they certify and how. I hope I replied to all the questions, and that I didn't miss on any.
No, thank you so much, okay. Anna. We have a lot of questions, but I think many of them are for us. So I will respond to them after we hear from Anna Golub. We have 3 Annas here today, and it's over to Anna Golub to give a little bit of an update from the UN Women's work on stimulating equal opportunities for women entrepreneurs through gender-responsive procurement. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, and to all of the Annas. And I was great actually hearing from both panelists, because I learned a lot, but it also is in alignment with what we're doing. So it's always very gratifying to see that we're not alone in our thinking. So I am a policy analyst. I work on our flagship program, Stimulating Equal Opportunities for Women Entrepreneurs. And just to take a step back, and this is a guide that we produced in 2017, I'll talk about that in a second, but just to take a step back and look at what we mean by gender responsive procurement. You know from both of the panelists that it obviously has to do with empowering women, because the idea is that that procurement is trillions and trillions of dollars. In Europe, 15% of GDP, in developing countries, 30% of GDP. It's a huge market, and the thing is that it's not in a vacuum. It's not gender neutral, and there are both processes and bureaucratic issues within it that cause barriers to entry for women entrepreneurs. There are the social, like the way the economy is ordered affects women's ability to access opportunities or benefit from it. As Stephanie was saying, women are most found at the lower segments of the supply chain without access to social protection, and in the most vulnerable and precarious areas. Like, why is that? And why and how? And the point is, gender responsive procurement is a lever, it's a strategic lever to empower women. It's to realize that there are power relationships embedded in these market transactions. And in order to tackle those, it requires like different policies, strategies, and tools. But we all have to work together, because central to gender responsive procurement, I think, would be relationships, because buyers and sellers are relationships, but also there's people around in the market system, like Amphori and like UN Women, who are there to help build a better gender responsive procurement ecosystem. So interestingly, we didn't hear from speakers that were focusing on explicitly affirmative procurement for sourcing for women-owned businesses. So I'll just talk a little bit about our program and how that fits in. But we have a flagship program that is embedded in UN Women's strategic plan, and it's based on a theory of change that encompasses the action that all stakeholders are supposed to take. So this is the way the roadmap theoretically for how we engage with partners. And there's 4 aspects to it, 4 outcomes. And the first one is gender responsive procurement. As I mentioned, it's a strategic lever to have a lot of impact. And then this is not that slide for this one, I'll get to. There's a strategic level of impact. We have supply chains, access to supply chains that includes the skills, includes enhancing women, trying to elevate their position in the supply chains. The third one is, of course, the women's empowerment principles. If you have both mentioned, there's an incredibly important need to be able to identify gender responsive companies, to be able to help companies be compliant with the standards that we set for gender equality. So the WEPs are one of those standards, and so helping companies be gender responsive and governments gender responsive all throughout their process, all throughout the organization is important. And then finally, there's access to finance. And so we have about 20 countries around the world picking up various aspects of that theory of change and working with partners to increase sourcing from women-owned businesses, but also what we're pushing forward at UN Women, which we hadn't done before. We were usually focusing on an aspect of gender-responsive procurement, which is the sourcing from women-owned businesses. And so a lot of the manual that I showed you before is this great guide for companies that has all the very specific details about the kinds of interventions a company can take to remove the barriers to sourcing from women entrepreneurs, the way that they design the tender. It's interesting to see where the limitations are in Europe for that, so it's really important to know the legal framework and what your wiggle room is for having these kinds of social outcomes that you're procuring for. But I think what we heard from Anna is like at the very central is shifting away from cost savings to creating value, because cost savings, the argument here is cost savings. If that is the absolute purpose of procurement, eventually we do run into a problem in that it may directly conflict with gender equality. So there's not necessarily no trade-off, because the pressure to drive costs down is what's spreading women off into these lower ends of the supply chain. So just important to recognize that there's a causal relationship between the way procurement is practiced today and the kind of distribution of power women have in the supply chains. So just really quickly, I want to showcase something that's coming out with us in the ILO. That's the slide with the magic triangle that I was showing before. But what we are, in order to push this for UN Women, we're looking at procurement in terms of 3 facets. To recognize it's not in a vacuum. I have facet 3 on top, but so I'll start with facet 1, which is about entrepreneurship. So you're seeing the linkages between entrepreneurship and the enabling environment on one side, and you're seeing entrepreneurship and employment, and entrepreneurship and employment in the enabling environment. So the point is here that that procurement has 3 facets, and one of them is what a lot of companies are doing and a lot of countries are doing, which is the affirmative side. There's several. In the United States, they actually have a 5% target at the federal level for procuring from women's businesses. And actually, just as a side note related to COVID-19, they are tagging women-owned businesses with their COVID procurement, and it's 5.7% as I checked this morning, at about $890 billion or $1 million, almost $1 billion that have COVID procurement that has gone to women-owned businesses in the United States. So this is like, it's only 5%, but these are tremendous opportunities that they may not have already had. So the core sort of traditionalist vision of gender responsive procurement has been on affirmative sourcing from women entrepreneurs, but there's legal framework issues depending on your context. And so it's really interesting to hear from Europe, whereas in the United States it's very different. So the next thing, which I think is great that M4E and also you are doing as far as employment, is we're not looking at supply chains just as one women entrepreneur that is the sole sourcer. There are women all throughout the supply chain in any market transaction that a buyer has with the supplier. There are workers that are informal and formal, both directly working for the company as well as a woman-owned business that is supplying that. So the dream, the vision is, if we had this world where we're actually able to hold companies accountable because we had proper reporting, because we had regulations in place, then that would be a world, if everybody's sourcing from using common standards such as the WEPs and the ILO fundamental conventions and holding everyone accountable, that's a world that induces jobs for women's businesses and for women workers, that induces decent jobs. So we're not talking about just supporting women entrepreneurs to get income. We're supporting jobs, decent jobs for women at all levels of the supply chain. But finally, the facet 3, which is on top, which you have to understand, and what our work is based on, is the gender perspective to procurement in general. And again, I mentioned this model we're doing with the Women's Entrepreneurship Development Program in the ILO. So it's really important to recognize the help that they've given us for imagining the employment aspect of this. But again, as I said, because the market interactions are gendered, you have to recognize when you're doing procurement, it's not only about the workers and the suppliers in the way that it's gendered, it's also about the consumers, which are the people who are using your products or the people who are using the government services. So when you're taking a piece of the state and outsourcing it, there's gendered consequences to that, because the people that are using those services and the people who are supplying those services may be differentiated based on gender. But then you have a piece of the state that is now market-based regulated, as opposed to what you would have in like a government, like doing it directly. And so it really depends, the amount of decent work and the amount of entrepreneurs and the amount of women's empowerment you have in that situation. It really does depend on your practicing of gender responsive procurement, and also creating the enabling environment, which is the finance, which is the skills, which is all of the women's empowerment principles. So the point is just to bring together all the things that we're doing. I'm really glad to see that we are pushing forward this, and UN Women is really looking forward to working all across the board to continue in these 20 countries and even more with pushing this model forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was excellent presentation. We have a lot of additional questions, but I think I'm basically a lot of them relate to the women's empowerment principles. So I will just take, we are running a bit over time, but I'm going to take just 1 minute to kind of run through some of those. Some of them relate to what actions can be taken during COVID-19. So we have on our website, weps.org/resources, 2 calls to action for the private sector. We're working on other calls to action for other stakeholders, but we have one that is generic to the COVID-19 broadly. What can a web signatory do? We also have one specifically on domestic violence, because that has been a shadow pandemic to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have that on our website. And Sandra was making a comment that change starts from the top, and that is also why we need to we require for web signatories to have the CEO sign the principles to make sure that it's a top down. Of course, up bottom up is also important, but that the company is led by a leader that believes in gender equality and women's empowerment. Faz wants to get more involved, and I think there's a lot of opportunities. We have an activity that will start in July in working with Women Business Association across the European Union and the G7. So we will be working on an advocacy tool. So there are a lot of opportunities to get involved later on. But if you want to be in touch with us, there are 3 ways. Of course, if you sign the Women's Empowerment Principles, you're automatically part of our network and our outreach and invitations to webinars and our newsletter, etc. You can also go to the website, weps.org, and at the bottom in the footer, there's sign up to our newsletter if you're not a web signatory yet. But you can also email us at weps@unwomen.org. In terms of knowing if companies are actually gender responsive that have signed the Women's Empowerment Principles, we have started to go a little bit deeper in investigating that. We are working on case studies, and I welcome anyone that has good case studies of how a company has implemented gender equality can do that. You're welcome to contact us. We have also a new feature on the website where companies can show a little bit more of what they are doing. We call them the company profiles that you will find under weps.org/companies. And we are working on a tracking system that companies will be able to showcase a little bit better how gender responsive they are. So that will be a new feature in September. And finally, there was a question about if there are databases of women that have already been engaged in procurement and that have engaged in supply chains. And from us as UN Women, of course, we have our own database that we are tracking, which are the women-owned businesses. But I can also recommend that We Commit International are also working on the certified. So Anna Gollop talked a little bit about the certified women-owned businesses. And we are also tagging our web signatories, whether they're women-owned. And that is also a way that we will build out, and women-owned businesses can share a little bit more information on this. So I think we have a poll that we'd like to run before we close. So I think we can activate that. Thank you. So after the webinar, how informed are you of gender responsive policies on procurement? Somehow informed, informed, well informed. Okay. Great. There's a lot to it. Procurement is not that we can cover in 1 hour. There's a lot of dimension, as we heard from the different speakers. So the good news is that we will have another webinar later on in the year that we will continue to discuss this. Next question is, did you benefit from the event? Yes or no? Yes, great. Well done, panelists. Thank you very much. And I think we have a final question. Overall, how satisfied are you with the information received? Very, somehow, neither satisfied or nor dissatisfied, somehow dissatisfied, more information is needed. Of course, more information is needed. We'll continue these conversations over the next few months, and we will also have some written guidance on gender responsive procurement. We'll continue the dialogues. And we look forward to engaging with you. And I'd like to thank our very good. More information, of course, is needed, but I think overall our participants are very happy. So I would like to thank Stephanie, Anna, and Anna for your presentations, and for all the participants for being such great participants with excellent questions. And I would like to also mention that we have from the ILO side a webinar on Friday, tomorrow, on COVID-19 and violence and harassment. So I welcome you to join that. You can see on empowerwomen.org under events, you will find all the details about this webinar. And I think a lot of the participants will appreciate this because there were a lot of questions on this topic and a lot of concerns. So I would like to thank you, everyone, and we hope to be in touch and hear from you either through the sign up to the newsletter, new web signatories, and or by email. So we'll be in touch. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.